with absolutely nothing. Actually, no way. Sort of speaking of money, budgets. I don't know. There was an article released on a Substack called Hush Crasher, which is a data-driven, I guess, blog. They've got one article. It's about analyzing video games with data. And hey, I like looking at some data. This article is entitled, by the way, What's a AA? It's by Antoine Meyerowitz and Julie Belzan. I think I'm saying that correctly. Essentially, the goal of this article is to create a more objective definition of terms like AA, AAA, indie, or maybe to come up with some terms of their own that are more accurate. This is an interesting article, and I actually like a lot of parts of it, and I find the data really fascinating. I don't know if it's perfect, and they have admitted that this is like a revision 1 of their methodology, so it could very well be refined in the future. But I find this to be really interesting and worth talking about. So essentially, the goal of this project was to take the ambiguity out of how we define the scope of a game. These are definitions for the scope, from like basically, essentially budgets. What is the budget? Which also implies how much it's expected to make back. AA and AAA actually come from the bonds industry. Those are like the initial usage of it, and they're I believe related to the security or the safety, the risk factor of a given investment. So I'll read directly. The good news is that there is a whole strand of data science dedicated to finding groups of similar elements based on their characteristics, known as clustering. So this is basically they took a bunch of different factors which are available via API from Moby Games. It is data from all games published on Steam since 2006, cross-referenced with stuff from Moby Games to provide additional information, because Moby Games has their own API. And then they've broken down into a bunch of different categories and then found which categories caused the most consistent clustering to basically break down what qualities of a game's scope correspond the most strongly with each other. And what they came down to, interestingly enough, was the length of the credits and the size on disk. Now, immediate criticisms of this, although I do like this in general, are that these are a little bit wiggly, and don't necessarily tell a whole story. Ideally, you would have the budgets for every single game, but we just don't. Ideally, you would want the budget for every game. So instead, what they've done is they found that the number of credits, not counting so the number of credits, not counting, I think, like double ups or people who maybe pulled double, triple duty, unique people who worked on a game. It also excludes special thanks, because that's very difficult to quantify, and it excludes playtesters, which is probably maybe the most controversial part of this. I understand why they did it, because it's also quite difficult to quantify how many, like sometimes it's outsourced, the rates of pay can be different. There's also the fact that playtesting can be done by the devs. There's a lot of reasons that playtesting can be a little weird when trying to track the contributions to the team, because it is one of the most commonly outsourced positions. I'm very pro respect to playtesters, I think that they're an integral part of the game development process. So it's like unfortunate that it excludes them, but I kind of get it. I would be interested to see how the data changes if you do include playtesters. But let's just take this as it is for the moment and say, okay, so number of unique entities with a Moby Games identifier. That is how they define, excluding special thanks and playtesters. That is how they define credits count. And then size on disk. So size on disk is not like the most accurate. There is some wiggle room there as well, because the size can be, I mean, certain things can cause outliers. For instance, the big hubbub about why does this game take up like 500 gigabytes on my PS4? And it's because the developers force you to download the 4K texture pack that you never use, which has also led to optional downloads of texture packs and stuff like that. Technically, you can make a game with like one person could put together a game with NES graphics, but also include like, I don't know, an entire 4K video file of The Dark Knight and jack up the game size tremendously from what it would be otherwise. So again, not a perfect, in like a logical sense, there's holes that you can poke with the size on disk. But apparently these have the highest correlation to each other. Or the highest correlation in the sense that they create the most clusters. They have the most things in common. Now, with this data, they create a pretty interesting chart, which they break down into actually 4 distinct categories. And they've come up with some of their own terminology for this, which some people don't like. There was some criticism of like, I don't like this term. I don't really care. They have eschewed the word indie because indie is too vague. Technically, like indie, I've talked about this before. Indie is a kind of very difficult term to get any use out of. This was exposed with like the whole, is Dave the Diver an indie game? Because technically the original meaning was self-published, but now a lot of stuff is self-published. Assassin's Creed is developed and published by Ubisoft. Assassin's Creed, by that definition, is an indie game. So are tons of games from big publishers and developers. Capcom is a self-publisher. Street Fighter 6 is an indie game. A funny thing that was pointed out to me the other day, outside of the realm of video games, the Star Wars prequels are all independent films. Self-financed, self-produced, top to bottom, all owned by George Lucas through his own companies. It is about as indie as you could get. It's just at a massive scale. So is independent a useful descriptor? Yeah, in some sense, if you want to talk about the relationship between maybe what are the certain like financial pressures on projects, if they have an outside publisher or distributor that they have to worry about. But for the scope, when you really get honest about the meaning, as close as you can get to an objective meaning for the term indie, it kind of falls apart. It's not really that useful. So they have broken this down into 4 categories, which they kind of also blob into two larger categories of bigger games and smaller games, top end and bottom end. So in the top end, you've got AAA and AA games. AAA games are anything with like, hang on, there's a more specific chart, or a chart with more explicit numbers, a more detailed one. I would love an interactive version of this to see what games qualify for what. So for just like reference, this is divided. So just for reference of how the graph looks, linked down below, it's essentially just like a scatter plot, where from the bottom left to the top right, so going upwards, there is just like a median line of this seems to be like the bottom end. There aren't that many things below this. And then from the top left to the bottom right, kind of cutting across that, are where they make their divisions. So a AAA game is generally, if you've got a team of 4,000, you must be a AAA game. There's that is the you cannot have more people than that and qualify for anything else. If you have a size of 700 gigabytes or larger, you must be a AAA game. Those are like the extremes. That also means that you could have a team of 2,000 people with a size of 300 gigs or 200 gigs, and you are still firmly in the AAA space. Below that, you have the wider margin of AA games. So applying the same idea. If you have a team of 500 people, automatically AA. If you have a size of, let's see, what's the minimum here? Well, 700, yeah, a size of, am I reading that correctly? I want to say I'm reading that correctly. It looks like team size actually, I'm not sure about the team size thing. Team size to game size. I don't know if there's like a, I'm not a data scientist. You think I took a statistics class? Also because like the way that it's split is in like an odd, it's like an odd rectangular shape with like the top cut off. If you look at the graph, you'll see why it's a little difficult to like tell exactly what is the minimum game size to be considered a AA game. You could be a 4 gigabyte game, but if you have a team of 500 people, you can be AA. I'll stop trying to be perceptive. Now we get into the lower end. So that's like the top, the higher end, right, of the spectrum. Now we get into the lower end where they have come up with 2 of their own categories, 2 of their own labels. So below AA are what you might consider. So okay, so I'll for reference, a AAA game. The example they give is Red Dead Redemption 2. A AA game is something like Clair Obscure. Below that, they have what they call MIDI games, which is actually, I believe, a clothing term. It is somewhere between small and large, medium-ish. MIDI. It's like a MIDI length. The example they give is The Outer Wilds. The Outer Wilds, Hades, Valheim, generally what a lot of people would commonly call larger indies. It's just a more specific, larger indies. So, for instance, a team size of like 70 will guarantee that you are in the MIDI category, probably just based off of like budget requirements. Those are MIDI games. Small and medium studios. They are between the intimacy of, well, spoilers, and the larger ambition of AA's. And then let's get to the smallest category. Well, it's not the smallest category, but it is the smallest scope category. It's actually the largest in terms of sheer volume. They call it K-E-I, named after the K car, which is like a very compact style of Japanese car. They define this as what many would call solo dev games. Popular examples are Undertale, Papers, Please, or Terraria. While they are often the work of a lone creator, they can also be made by a couple of friends or siblings. The term K captures this sense of small scale in reference to Japan's famously tiny car. I'm not a car guy, I'd never heard of it. So, if you cross-reference like the methodology that they used with certain games, generally something made by a small team where most of the roles are fulfilled by 1 or 2 or 3 people, also tends to limit the scope of the game, like the size of the game's literal like storage space. nodding, and then maybe including like translators and localizers for other regions, would generally be considered a K game. So again, the methodology is not entirely perfect. They go on to use a couple other. This is what the data that they input found created clusters. So I think that that's worth looking at, and I think it's also a more interesting way of looking at the data. They go on to talk about certain trends in the industry because they also track stuff over time, how much of the market is represented by what categories of games, and how much, both in how much is coming out and what is actually making money. So, according to their definitions, there is this break point around 2012. They mark this as when Steam Greenlight gets introduced, which was Steam's big opening to small independent creators. It was a big disaster. It has since been reeled in. There's a reason you don't hear about Steam Greenlight anymore. After this point, starting in like 2013 and 2014, the number of K games released, K scope games, increases dramatically, exponentially, to the point that in 2024, they account for 75% of all releases. It is the largest sector of the market is in these small team, solo dev, or very small team, like below 10 people, K games. Followed by MIDI games, and then AA and AAA. AAA being the very smallest slice. However, interestingly enough, if you look at sales data, so, okay, compare this to the sales data. Caveat here, they do not have the sales data for every game ever released. It's not always public. It can vary by platform. What they've done, and again, this is it's not a perfect methodology, but I think it's decent, is use the number of reviews that each game has. Because the number of reviews is like a indicator for it's a conservative indicator of how many people have bought and played the game. Kind of the same way that comments, the ratio of views to comments on a YouTube video, is an indicator of your audience. A video with 2 million views might have 300 comments, right? So just going by using reviews as a proxy for sales, each sector takes up about a quarter of the market. Again, this is mainly looking at Steam, so it's not complete. They say, sure, there are more K games available, but are people actually buying them? The truth is, the shock, this is being they call it the indie shock, or the K shock, going by their terminology, which happened as digital distribution mediums, or digital distribution channels opened up, as well as more accessible consumer-level game-making software like Unity. Game Maker became more accessible to people. This created a big. This is again around 2012. Created what they call a shock to the market, which caused this huge surge in representation for K scope games. The shock was so important that the market simply couldn't absorb it. Despite making up 75% of new releases in 2024, the share of reviews allocated to K games hasn't changed for a decade. It remained remarkably stable, never getting above about 25%. So they have another graph here, which tracks the number of reviews, the share of total reviews by scope, by level. So there's a couple like spikes, for instance, in 2015, because again, this is going by Steam reviews. In 2015, GTA 5 and Rainbow Six Siege are released on PC. There's a massive spike in review share in the AAA space, which kind of cuts into everything else. Okay, naturally. Then around 2017, PUBG hits a huge surge in players. PUBG is what they consider it a MIDI game. Now there's a big hump in the MIDI area, and all of these categories kind of ebb and flow as big games come out, impactful games with big audiences come out in these different categories. Of course, not all games are created equal, quoting from the article. Many are never played. In fact, 4 out of 10 games released in 2024 haven't even received 10 reviews. Some are likely bad, but most are certainly just less visible, lost in the overwhelming flood of competing titles. This is where the real picture comes in. K games have definitely swamped the market, but they haven't exactly taken away the sales. If there's competition, it's among K games themselves. What we're seeing is an almost perfect split, each segment claiming a quarter of the market. So you get almost this gradient of quantity versus number of sales. There's a ton of K games. A ton. But most of them make no money and are very cheap to begin with. Like, typically maybe $5, $10 or less. On the flip side, there are fewer AAA games. Way fewer. It's the vast minority of the market are AAA games, due to the cost to produce them and the number of people involved and typically the length of time that it takes to produce them. But because of their marketing, because of their presence, typically they have a push from a larger publisher or a brand name, they just make way more money per game. And then in between you have these these in-betweeners of MIDI and AA, which makes sense to me. Yes. So they have another graph claiming to show K Games revenue collapsed after 2012. So in 2014, K Games grew by 70%. There were 70% more of them. Revenue fell by 75%. So massively oversaturated market. Obviously, because it's a lot easier to make them. They say on a more positive note, the K-apocalypse is not just about destruction. The very same factors that led to market saturation, lower entry costs, and facilitated distribution have also led to a remarkable diversification of the industry. Developers can now create titles for very specific niches, knowing that even a few hundred sales can make the project worthwhile. Which is, I think, why these numbers are so consistent. They go on to say, players won't stop buying AAA because of the latest K game. In fact, they are probably not even the same players at all. And this might be a story for another time. This segmentation is also reflected in their retail prices, which are almost evenly spaced between each category. A K game costs only a few bucks, around $17 for MIDI games, $40 for AA's, and $60 for most AAA's available on Steam. And I think, in my personal experience, just anecdotally, that also kind of bears out. I am not much of a AAA gamer. I play tons of games all the time. I rarely engage with what you'd call AAA. Maybe AA, a lot of MIDI titles. I actually went and used their methodology to break down a couple games on my own. So I want to talk about that real quickly. So I began with the controversial game, Dave the Diver. So going by about 162 people, 14 of those being testers. So using the same methodology, take them out. 55 of those were thanks, leads to a dev team of about 38 people. 38, 40, let's call it 40 people. Judging by what's listed on Steam, it takes up 10 gigabytes on the disk. This puts it firmly in the middle of the MIDI category. It's just in the middle there. It's not quite AA. It's what a lot of people kind of got the vibe of. It feels like a maybe larger budget indie game. It's got a little more polish. It's got a publisher behind it, you know. Guilty Gear Strive, about 400 developers and about 30 gigs on disc. I believe that's before DLC. Before or after DLC, I'm not quite sure. That lands it solidly in the AA category. And yeah, that feels about right. It's definitely a bigger, more costly game than something like Dave the Diver, but I don't know if I'd compare it to like a Call of Duty. Just in scope. And again, we don't know the budgets. Maybe it costs more than Call of Duty, but again, it kind of lines up with the feel. And then finally, Baldur's Gate 3, a game with about... I'm amazed at how many people worked on this. About 1,700 people. Size of about 150 gigs. Lands it in the AAA category. On the slightly... And again, going by this metric, it is like slightly... Like, it's not like right in the middle, where they put other games such as Red Dead Redemption 2. It is like it's in the smaller cluster that's near the bottom. RDR2 would be like really top end Mondo. Like this is probably that would be where GTA 6 is gonna go, you know? But it's on like the lower end of AAA. Just the slightly lower end where mostly, or I'd say maybe more like the average end, because it's more like there's just a couple big outliers from gargantuan mega games. And again, a lot of people like me engage largely with games that are maybe $5 to $30 on average. That's like generally our price range, and we play games that are a little smaller, and we're generally content with that, or we get stuff on sale. I think a lot of people are like me, and they kind of tap out at maybe around a AA game. And every once in a while, if I've got a big attachment to it, if it's like a Street Fighter game, I'll shell out the $60 for the AAA experience. They go on to say, why don't we get more open-world platformers? A game's scope inherently dictates its genre possibilities, which means that by setting that scope, developers often tie their hands creatively. A K open world would be a suicide mission, while hiring thousands of people to create a simple 2D platformer may be interesting, but would certainly be a money pit. Which, yeah, makes sense. Not every game needs a massive, gigantic team. It might just not demand it. Like, have you ever been doing a school project and you're in groups of 4, but it's really a 3-person job, and you're the person who's left out, and you just feel bad. You feel like a parasite. One way to gauge these differences is to look at the game tags that are overrepresented or underrepresented within each group. This reveals the usual suspects. Multiplayer and co-op are common for what they call A games, double and AAA, while 2D and pixel graphics are distinctive of smaller scopes. This makes sense from an economic perspective, as the latter are much cheaper to make than the former. However, recent multiplayer K hits such as Lethal Company and Peak might be a turning point. And there's a really neat graph where they show, I don't know what the term for this is. It's like a frequency graph where they have a bunch of tags on the left, and then along each line, there's a line coming from each tag, left to right. From left being less frequent, right being more frequent. And then along that, they have, whether they've broken them down into the small and large scopes, so the top and bottom halves of their categories. And then which tags are more represented and how much. And then you can see how big the difference is between them. So for instance, multiplayer, third-person, open-world, co-op are the 5... Oh, and also great soundtrack, funny enough, are the 5 categories also the 5 top categories where the large scope games outnumber the small scope ones, which makes sense. You need more infrastructure to make a multiplayer game. You're going to need servers. It requires constant maintenance, and usually that comes with like a live service model that also, in addition to just like server maintenance, also like balance and content updates, and it just requires more money. Open worlds are more expensive to make. Co-op games, curiously, it's not like the hardest thing. Probably not the hardest thing to make a co-op game at a small scale, but I don't know. It's probably more consistent with games that are a larger scale to have like online components to them that allow for co-op. Remake is one where the large scope games have a big lead on the smaller scope ones, which again makes sense. Bigger publishers are going to want safer bets. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the 2 categories in which the small scope games, actually a few categories, I would say the 3 categories, 4 categories, 5, where the small scope games have a large lead are indie, naturally, casual, interestingly enough, probably, I would say casual probably because smaller scale games tend to be a little more experimental and might not have as much of a focus on intense gameplay, although there are certainly tons of indie games with intense gameplay, but like visual novels or something like that, or very narrative heavy, stripped down experiences like, I don't know, milk inside a bag of milk, something like that. 2D, again, because it just tends to be cheaper to make something in 2D than 3D or full 3D. Pixel graphics for the same reasons. Roguelike and procedural generation, as well as action roguelike, which those are kind of connected. The reason that when you go on Steam Next Fest and it feels like every action game has the roguelike tag is because you don't have to handcraft a bunch of content. You can make a bunch of components and then make up an algorithm to generate a layout for those components. It's just easier. Not to discredit like roguelike developers. I enjoy a good roguelike every once in a while, but that's literally just like the reality of the situation is, yeah, it's a lot cheaper. Dude, Rogue was made in like 1979. And the formula hasn't changed too much since then. Meanwhile, open world games weren't really a thing until like the 2000s. Maybe Daggerfall, but Daggerfall's fucking crazy. Also, hidden object games, way bigger on the small scale, which makes a lot of sense. As well, just more niche, I would say, again, more kind of low to the ground genres, such as score attack, bullet hell, tower defense, precision platformer, text-based. These are categories in which the small, the K, and the MIDI size have massively outnumber the larger scope games. Also NSFW, and then there's a huge gap between minimalist and experimental. So the small scope games, as you might expect, tend to have a lot more minimalism and a lot more experimental. I think it's funny to give a tag called experimental. There's a graph later on that talks about the estimated costs of games based on all of these categories. How did they get this data? According to them, they spent countless hours gathering hundreds of known budgets, leaks, and insider knowledge. With this data, we've built a game budget prediction model and we'll tell you more about it next time. So I'm very curious as to what that is, what the game budget prediction model, and how accurate it actually is. So yeah, there are some criticisms. There are some criticisms of the methodology. Some people don't like the terminology. They just prefer, what if we just did single A? I've thought of single A as a term. I've talked about that before. I think it would be better to phase out indie as a category if you're talking about a game's budget. And budget and scope, because it's just not really useful. I supplied the logical term, which is single A. I think you could easily just replace MIDI with single A in your mind. And then I don't mind the K distinction. What would be below A? Z? A Z game? K games, I guess. Because again, it's not like a perfect methodology. A lot of it is based off of taking the best approximation of data. There's a ton of stuff that isn't viable. And of course, scope itself is sort of an abstract concept. So it's hard to make a super objective measurement of scope. But I think that like the data that they've supplied in this study correlates enough that like if you just use like the basic rules that they laid out and cross-reference it against the graph of like where something falls based off of disk size and team size, I'm sure it breaks down for stuff maybe from like 20 years ago or before the invention of the term AAA. But for new releases or things from the last maybe 10, 15 years, I think that there's too much correlation and it makes too much sense to me to completely dismiss. And even if it's not, again, a perfect methodology, I think it has a lot more merit than just saying, well, AAA is for games that I don't like, and indie is for games that I like. Because that's just, it's like, to me, the purpose of breaking down these categories is to talk about the industry in helpful terms, and also to describe things like it is kind of adjacent to genres. And to me, genres, the reason you have genres are to recommend things more easily to people. The scope of something, I think, is helpful in understanding trends in the industry as well as what people are interested in, especially because I agree with their theory that these different categories also have their own distinct audiences. That's something that I observe, and probably that you observe hearing about it. You probably think, yeah, I think I fit into that, or I know someone who fits more into this kind of an audience or this kind of game. And I think that is worth it's worth investigating, because this is like way more interesting and way more helpful than just let's just go by feel. Yeah, Dave the Diver is an indie game. The study will be linked down below. I am very curious as to what this game budget predictor is. But yeah, I really enjoyed this article from Hush Crasher, and I am looking forward to where this goes and where this, what other stuff this blog could come up with, because this was really fascinating. All right. We're done talking about math.